Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Data Revolution podcast. Today, my guest is James Kavanagh, who is an AI governance guru, expert ninja. Welcome, James.
Thanks, Kate. Nice to talk to you. I wouldn't suggest that I'm an expert or a guru or a ninja. I don't know if there are any in AI governance right now. It's such a new field, but I've certainly been working in it for a little while and delighted to have a chat about it.
Well, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself by way
Okay.
of introduction?
Sure. Well, let me go back a little bit. I'll tell you a bit of my motivations. I
Mm-hmm.
started as a chemical engineer doing safety work out of college, and I spent a lot of my time in those first few years building chemical plant control systems, obsessed with safety, really obsessed with how things go wrong and how humans and computers fail in tandem. Moved across into software, joined Microsoft, moved to Australia, had a wonderful career in Microsoft in all sorts of different roles, eventually chief of security, then CTO in Australia. I had the fun and the privilege of building a few of Microsoft's public cloud regions here in Australia. Moved to London, moved to Amazon, the other one of the three big cloud providers. And there I ran regulatory engagement. So I've always kind of had a half a foot in engineering and building things, and then half a foot in proving them and working with regulators. So in Amazon, I was the interface between engineering and regulators for much of that time. Built some interesting technologies with AI that were really about trying to understand what are all the world's regulations and policies, translate them into engineering language so we could guide engineering decisions. And then a couple of years ago, we could see the wave of AI coming along. So I shifted into building a team that drove the AI governance initiatives for Amazon. We created the AI policies, we ran the programs, created the mechanisms for risk and compliance. I eventually achieved ISO 40001. And then I decided to leave Amazon and set up an organization that would really focus on how do we teach others, how do we create the tools for meaningful AI governance. And so I launched AI Career Pro, which is one part of the business just recently. Last week, we launched our first courses, and it's been tremendously positively received. And we're working on some engineering practices as well. And we always stay in this kind of world of half building and half teaching. And it's quite fun to see how fast everything is going.
Oh my God, things are moving so fast. So why don't we just start? Because I think everybody talks about AI governance and we don't really define it. What do you mean when you talk about AI governance?
Yeah, I tend to focus on how it is that we build AI systems that are safe, secure, and lawful. I think that's the
Mm-hmm.
primary purpose of AI governance is to make sure that the decisions that we take in terms of what we build, how we build it, how we operate it, are always safe, secure, and lawful. I find the term responsible AI a little difficult because it's a little too nebulous. It's very non-specific and it can be abused as a term.
Purposefully so, I imagine.
Yeah, it can be used to present an image of sustainable, socially responsible behavior. I like the term safe, secure, lawful as really being the objectives. What I find really interesting in governance and why I'm so attracted to it is that it's not necessarily defined by the technology. It's really defined by the connection between different disciplines, whether you're the scientist or the engineer or the auditor or the lawyer. I think AI governance is primarily about how you bring those disciplines together so that everybody's perspective is in the room and yet you can make the right decisions.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because I've often felt that all the interesting problems are at the boundaries. So I think that's an interesting thing that there's those boundaries between different kinds of spaces in addition to development. And the fact that AI governance, like it's moving so fast, like there for a while there was no standard, now there's a global standard, but I feel like hardly anybody's actually implemented it.
Well, I think people are implementing it. I think it's gradually starting to emerge in many organizations and people are starting to figure out how to ask the right questions and what are the sensible first practices. I think what's interesting is that yes, there are standards, yes, there are regulations like the EU AI Act and so on. And often they get a lot of the attention. Really, like a much more basic practices, are we building the right systems? Are they the systems that we should be creating? And when we do it, like, is it safe to do it? Are we protecting privacy? Are we making sure we're not harming people? And I think organizations are doing that. It's just that the disciplines and the practices and the know-how is relatively rare, but it is starting to emerge. And certainly there are a lot of jobs and there's a lot of demand in this kind of space. So I think it's happening. It's just very early days.
It's like the future, unevenly distributed.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And look, to some extent, it all depends on like what drives governance. Why does governance actually happen? Why does it become more embedded? And there's really usually two drivers.
Mm-hmm.
Either you have major incidents that cause concern, and a company doesn't want to have those incidents, so they put in place better safety practices, and whether that's like a cybersecurity breach or a safety issue or a privacy issue, or there's regulation. And like one of those two drives governance and the imposition and creation of governance. And I'm not sure yet.
Or the fear of those two things.
Yeah, maybe the fear of them. Or, well, I'll put it a bit more positively. The anticipation of the need for them, maybe, rather than fear.
Well, it's interesting to start to consider, because now the bad actors are starting to use AI against us. So it's not only a net benefit to society, everything that's a benefit is also a risk. So, I suppose that AI governance is also trying to protect us against those risks.
Yeah, and it's also trying to figure out like who is accountable at different parts of the supply chain. Like if there's a deep fake, let's say, and a lot of attention on deep fakes at the moment, particularly with Sora being released by
Oh, yeah.
OpenAI. And the question is, well, who is responsible? Who is accountable for that? I would say in most cases, this is really
Sam
OpenAI.
Altman.
Yeah, well, they could have been more careful. Many of the cases are. This is predictable. What happened with some of the famous personalities who are deepfaked. But at the same time, people are using this and creating these deepfakes. So there is a certain amount of responsibility and accountability to the users as well. And I think this is the challenge with much of AI. It's not so much that you can blame or attribute accountability to just one party. It's often an interplay between the providers of the systems itself, the organizations that are deploying them, and then the end users themselves. And it's not easy to allocate responsibility and good practice across all three of those.
One of the things that I wanted to talk about is this notion of a human in the loop. So, a lot of people talk about the importance of a human in the loop, and a lot of people disagree with that and say there needs to be human oversight and accountability. And I kind of look at with agentic AI, where we've got large scale business processes running unsupervised, and think, how can you realistically have a human in the loop? How do you decide where the human should be, and how do you make sure that there's effective oversight? Like, how do you think about those sort of questions?
Yeah, it's something that occupies, like, that's the other half of the work that we do, which is the human oversight mechanisms. And I think you have to start with some fundamentals. And to me, one fundamental is if it's a consequential decision, if there is a risk of harm, if there is potential damage, there has to be some form of meaningful human oversight.
Hmm.
And then it's a question of, if we can agree that there should be a level of human oversight, then it's a question of, well, what are the levers? What are the ways in which we can implement it? The challenge, I think, often comes down to is not so much that we need human oversight, but that the choices around how to implement it aren't always very effective or well designed. And we've seen that, let's say, with even systems from 10 years ago, like Robodebt, had a very intense human oversight mechanism of human checks. Were humans in the loop? They just rubber stamped though, and that was the problem. Human in the loop mechanisms are too easy to degrade. They may look great on paper. They may be very comforting and give us some false sense of security or confidence, but actually, human in the loop systems often degrade.
Well, I think Robodebt's a really good example to consider, because of the perverse incentives for people wanting to please their political masters and not perform the sort of old-fashioned pure play civil servant without fear or favour. And that used to be the defence mechanism that we used to have in the public service, in the public sector. And
Yep.
as the civil service notion of frank and fearless advice has dissipated, and we've got the role much more aligned with political masters, then we don't get that frank and fearless advice, because people are afraid they'll lose their jobs.
I think it comes down to two things. If you want to have humans effectively being able to provide oversight, they have to first have an ability to understand the decision. So,
Mm.
the question is, like, from a lot of the reporting, it wasn't clear that there was a lot of visibility into how some of the decisions were being made. And even those recipients of the demands were not often, they were not explained as to how a decision was made that they had a debt. It didn't provide details of which inputs were provided and how the decision was made and so on. And so they had no ability to challenge.
I actually got an advice from
Oh,
them
yeah.
that said I owed one. And I was like, no, that doesn't match my records. My solicitor will be in touch. Send
Well,
it to me and my solicitor will be in touch. Never heard from them again.
wow. Okay. Well, look at you. Look at you that you had the records. I think the difficult thing is a lot of people didn't have records and
I know,
maybe
who's
didn't
got
have that
records going
ability.
back 10 years?
But this is a really key point. The onus should have been on the department to provide that kind of information. So to make a decision that is automated or supported by an automated system, but not provide an explanation, that's like a real major failure in the human design of that system, never mind the technical aspects. So I think that's number one. If you want meaningful human oversight, you have to be able to provide explanations. And then the second major failure is, even if you can provide those explanations, does somebody have the ability to intervene and stop it? And so what seemed to be the case with Robodebt is that even though some of the welfare officers who were looking at these cases and were calling out red flags had no ability to actually stop the process. And so
Yeah.
that's, if you really want to have meaningful human oversight of an AI system, you have to be able to understand the decision. And secondly, you have to be able to intervene to stop or alter the decision.
And it's worth pointing out to people who are listening that Robodebt wasn't AI. It was an Excel spreadsheet, basically. So it wasn't even AI, but this could happen at vast scale using AI. And
Yep.
the interesting thing that strikes me is, in the Toyota manufacturing, where they introduced Kanban, where they had it that a person on the production line could pull the handle and stop the production line if they saw a defect. That kind of empowerment of people doesn't seem to have happened in that event, but it would be interesting to think through how that might happen with AI at scale.
Yeah. And like, you're right, it was a fairly low tech solution in the back end. But there have been cases that are quite similar, and have been, like, had used machine learning in the background and had these same problems. Like the Dutch child welfare case is almost a mirror image of Robodebt in that it was a process that used machine learning to perform matching. There was technically a rubber stamp process. The explanations provided to those child welfare workers were inadequate, and so they couldn't intervene. And it brought down the Dutch government. So similar kind of situations where, if we're going to do effective governance of AI systems, we've got to learn that this is not only a technical problem. This is a question of how do we design the human process of understanding and then intervening at the right times. And I think we're
It
missing some.
always comes down to human factors, doesn't it?
Well, that's part of it. It does. I mean, systems do what systems are told to do, generally, what they're designed to do, whether they're designed to do the right thing or the wrong thing. But it's when they interact with people or they're affecting people, that's when crazy things happen.
So, how can we think about building AI systems that can incorporate these different perspectives? Because I think we take a fairly technocratic perspective on how to build systems, including AI systems. So, how can, especially in business, we get our requirements and we build it very technologically focused. Like, how can we start to incorporate these other lenses into it so that we have a more rounded perspective on it?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is just being aware of the impact, like, and consciously, at times, consciously stepping back and understanding what are the potential ways in which this goes wrong. And so, like, one of the interesting things that we do is we're trying to think about building systems or working with clients on systems is to step back and understand what, right from the very beginning, who are the stakeholders, what are the use cases, and very quickly what drops out is what are the misuse cases, where could
I'm
things
kind
go
of
wrong.
smiling because a very engineering thing, an FMEA, a failure modes effect
Yeah.
analysis,
Yeah.
is the thing that leaps to my mind. It's an oldie but a goodie.
Yeah. No. Dependency chain analysis, failure modes effects analysis. These are all great techniques. They're difficult techniques if you don't have, like, the background and the training and the resources to do it. I like we used to in Amazon, and I do it with folks now. Is you can just ask 20 questions. Like
Hmm.
there are a small number of questions you can ask. Who will be affected by this? Who might be affected in a negative way? Whose personal data are we touching? And do we have consent to touch to look at that data? You know, you can ask some pretty basic questions and like actually address many of the big impacts or the big negatives up front if you take the time to ask it.
And that consent question is so interesting because on some AI systems that I've worked on, when you ask that, have we got consent? And they think they've got consent, but they've got some consent for another use, not that use. And it's actually a number of times led to a broadening of general consents to include AI because the consents were obtained prior to AI existing.
Yeah, and this is definitely an issue right now. This is an interesting point where I've had people say to me, "Well, you can kind of do a lot with AI right now because we don't have regulations yet." And like you're talking to Australia, have you ever heard of the Privacy Act? It's there are regulations. There's intellectual property, there's privacy regulations, there's security regulations. All of those affect AI right now. And so if you didn't previously have a collection notice that allowed you to
Mm-hmm.
have this secondary use of the data, you absolutely should not be using the data for those purposes. I've been working with a client who's working through exactly that problem. How do they deal with the realities that the data that they have and the consents that they've collected might not match the purposes for which they're now working? And the reality is, well, they got to go back. Uncomfortable and unfortunate as that might be, that's the whole point of a privacy collection notice. And so,
Well, other things, AI can reveal things that you might not have intended. It wasn't an AI related thing, but we did some mapping when I was working at a university on campus, and we because everybody that came on campus signed onto the network automatically,
yeah.
and we could track where people were physically on campus, both what floor they were on as well as what latitude, longitude they're at. And then we were noticing people going to one particular corner of the building and going, I wonder what's there. And we realized it was the toilets. So we could detect who was going to the toilet when. It was an unanticipated thing that we were finding from the data. So that kind of thing can happen with AI on a very grand scale where you will have these unexpected insights that you didn't intend to have,
Mm.
but you've got. And what do you do with them? Once you can't undiscover them.
Well, that's increasingly interesting when we're using software as a service now, and you
Mm.
don't fully have control about what data is collected and how it's presented. Microsoft found this years ago, introduced this was before much of the concern about AI, when there was a productivity score. There was this new feature that they were launching into Office 365, and it was a productivity score. And so it looked at the frequency of you sending emails and how quickly you'd respond to
I
them and
remember.
things like that. And so the engineers announced this and showed it off at a conference and said, look at this, this is amazing. Look how quickly we can show you your best and your worst workers. Well, it didn't take long for a European lawyer to step up and go, not a chance. I think it's fascinating. Microsoft just released a very, very similar feature in
I
Teams.
was just going to mention it, the Teams thing. Oh my God, tell everyone about it, please.
Well, I don't know too much about it. I haven't spent too much time on it. So you tell me. I just saw that they've introduced a feature of your location in the office.
Yeah,
So
it's apparently going to come out in December, and they will tell your boss where you are
great.
physically based
Wonderful.
on your IP address. I wonder if they'll be tracking VPN use as well. But it's the affordances that the technology gives us that we don't understand fully the implications
Yeah.
about the use of them. So, we could work out who was going to the toilet when we didn't really intend to do that. Microsoft is going to open a can of worms with this Teams location thing. How can we build AI systems? So the 20 questions thing is a good thing. I often tell people to use the Open Data Institute's data ethics canvas because it's
Mhm.
just a good one-page thing to a bunch of useful questions to ask before you build a data product.
Yeah. I mean, there's lots of different ways. It all comes down to, I think, like involving the right people early enough to ask questions. And I think that's the challenge is that some of these technologies are being built influenced by the people who are building them. They're built by engineers who are probably predominantly male in California. I don't want to like demographically slice it, but the reality is it's not necessarily built by a population that's representative. And so, to their credit, Microsoft has actually taken quite a lot of effort to try to create mechanisms to bring in broader stakeholders. And some organizations you can definitely see are doing this. Like Anthropic are very deeply invested in bringing in experts and different demographics on testing their models before they release. OpenAI seem to have gone full tilt the opposite direction.
Not that way. My
Yeah.
God.
So yeah, I mean, and I just think it is amazing if when you're designing systems and you're in those early stages of putting together a wireframe and you're thinking through how it should be built, and then you bring in a user and that user just goes, this is never going to work, that's not going to work this way and that way, and just that user perspective changes everything about what you build and generally makes it a much better product. But if we think we can build all these AI systems just by releasing them into the world and then cleaning up afterwards, I think that's a mistake. We have to be much more careful in the way that we're actually building and releasing these kind of systems.
One of the problems that sort of strikes me, and you alluded to it earlier with the fact that most organisations aren't going to be building their own AI. They're going to be buying software as a service, or they're going to be buying some kind of product.
Yep.
And so they buy it as is, they get whatever they're given, and they don't necessarily understand the risks that they're buying along with that. How might people deal with that sort of issue?
Well, let me ask you the scenario. Are you talking about an organization buying it for the organization, or an
Mm.
individual within the organization buying, which is the scarier one often, in that with software as a service so easily available and the convenience of some of these tools, like, they're just so convenient, so immediately easy to use, that the reality is I think there's a lot of shadow AI that is just bypassing any
Oh,
normal safeguards that you would expect an organization to apply.
so one of the areas that we've found very recently is people bringing AI note takers to meetings. So we've literally blocked at Firewall a very long list of them, but we're conscious we haven't got them all, but we got the ones that keep turning up at meetings. But we've not given explicit permission for that to happen. We don't really want that to happen
Yeah.
because Lord knows where that data is.
There are some incredible ones, like, and just some of the most common ones that are out there, like Otter AI. If you see that one, I think that's probably number one. And then
Mm.
Fireflies is one from the UK. There's so much difference in the terms and like contractual terms and the way in which each of those behave, that you kind of almost need to be at least comfortable with the law to be able to understand what you're signing up for with some of them. So, like, Otter AI will say that it's like de-identifies your data, but then will use your data for model training. And like, I would never use that. I would never be comfortable with that. I'd never allow. So I don't. When I have calls with clients and one of these appears, I always tell them the consequences of having the conversation. I'll usually end the call. Like, we won't
Well,
have.
the thing is that though that's just if they've got it in the Zoom or Teams session that you're running. They
Yep.
can have it running on your phone and you have no idea that that is happening. So you can't really stop it. Increasingly this is a real, like, I think the proliferation of third party risk where it's daisy chained so much, so you're using Teams, which you're paying for but doesn't train the model, but then somebody's using Fireflies or
Yeah.
Otter and that's going out and that's training their model. And then, other things are daisy chaining onto this. So we've got so much third party risk now. It's like, how do you control for it?
Well, it's interesting because the one thing you don't want to do is say you can't use any AI tools. And that's the danger, because in some ways, if you do that, all you do is create either kind of calcify the innovation and the experimentation that people are having. And that just doesn't work in many organizations. Or they find backdoors and ways around it. So, they'll use their personal device rather than their work device and still do the same thing. Look, I think the difficult answer, to me, the difficult answer is education. We have a responsibility to engage people on what are the risks, what are the choices that can be made, and then put the guardrails in place behind them. So it's a little bit like 15 years ago when we started really teaching people about cyber hygiene on their home computers. Yes, it
Mm.
was, there needed to be better tools in place and there needed to be better guardrails, but also you had to teach people. People had to learn about spam and about frauds and scams and so on, and become users that are aware of risks. And I don't think we can avoid that difficult work of educating.
That's what we're just starting to do. But one of the other things is that we're just going, this is our platform, this is our corporate platform, use this one, and then we're going to start blocking access from the corporate network. But the other thing that we're doing is adding data loss prevention to the picture. So we're going to prevent egress of data from our network to those platforms. So you need to have a multi-layered protection strategy. Not a lot of the thing is, it's all right if you're in a bigger corporate because you've got the people who understand DLP and stuff. But if you're in a smaller enterprise, you don't know what DLP
No,
means.
no. And it's not going to even be effective. You know, in a small organization, DLP is always a probabilities game.
Hmm.
And sorry for any data loss prevention tools, which will basically look at the content that's going back and forth in your network. But the truth is, with many of these systems, they have an encrypted tunnel to a browser. You don't necessarily have an ability to perform DLP unless you terminate at a gateway. And so the reality is, if you have to do that, then you've probably broken the application. And so there's all sorts of interesting consequences of trying that strategy. It's the control that can work, but it's not necessarily 100%. And for many small businesses, it's just not a viable
No,
approach.
it's not viable if you're not a large organization.
Yeah.
So it's going to be an interesting landscape where pretty much the small to medium enterprises, they're going to be using these tools because they are so useful for them, being largely unaware of the potential consequences. Like one of the things we used to do at the university was we always used to, ask like, who owns the data in your SaaS platform? Like, who owns it? What are you going to do with it? What jurisdiction will it live in? All of
Yeah.
those sort of questions. And they would always say to us things like, "Oh, other universities have just signed with us without asking all of these pesky questions." And we go, "Well, we're asking them. Answer them, please." But they would get quite offended that we were asking those sort of questions.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, the most, I always say the best questions you can ask is to have like a 15-minute interview with the engineer. That's what I love the most. Is so, and you can do that if you're a large organization, to be honest. Like somebody who's selling a product and you ask to speak to the engineer, they're not going to make that engineer available. But the questions that you need to ask are often not the questions that people are asking. And I think even large organizations are asking for things like an ISO certification or an IRAP assessment report, or is your data in Australia, things like that. And they're not really the telling questions. The real question is, what incidents have you had? And how did you act when you had them? Those kinds of
And
questions.
who did you notify? Did you notify your other customers?
Yeah, I like it, and that's why I like to talk to engineers, because engineers don't know how to lie. They can't help themselves telling you the truth. So it's fun to have a conversation with an engineer and ask them, what are your real safety practices? How are you handling private information? And the answers are often very, very telling, because so few systems are really designed with a lot of these safety protections in mind. They tend to get to be bolted on later, and
Well,
it's too late.
there was one software as a service AI that we were using at a previous employer, and they were not able to give us access to reporting. We wanted to get access to reporting and they couldn't give it to us. And it took us a year to realize that everything was in a commingled database. So there was no separation. And they'd represented that it was, and it wasn't. It was just from keeping on asking that question that we were like, oh my God, it's all in the one database. And there is no logical or physical separation between customer data. And by then it was too late because we were already invested in it, anyway.
Well, so that's the fascinating question. If you really ask and you find out that information, I think that's the difficult thing. You then have to do something about it.
Yeah, what do you do?
Well, it forces you to difficult circumstances. You might say, need to move off that platform. And that's then business disruption. So I think this is a difficult thing. Some of these applications are so convenient, so useful, that organizations are adopting them, not really fully thinking through the consequences. And by the time they get to think about those consequences and, where is the data? How is it being used? How could it be used? At the time when they ask those questions, it's sometimes too late because the business impact of moving off the platform or finding an alternative is just too expensive or too difficult. So
Yeah, it was so entangled by, a year in. So that sounds like you're advocating to be asking all of those questions as part of the procurement process.
well, yes to asking them, but I think it's more a case of being able to understand the answers. So this
Hmm.
this is sometimes, I used to do this a lot when I was in Microsoft and Amazon. We would get questionnaires a lot, and like big enterprises send out lots of questionnaires in their procurement processes. And the reality is very often they weren't listening to the answers or deeply asking the question in a way that would allow them to evaluate anything. So you would sometimes see a question like, do you have an AI policy? Go, yes, we have an AI policy. Good, tick, move on. Well, that's not the real question. The real question is, do you apply it? And in what cases are you not applying it? What's in that policy?
Yeah, what's in it is the first question. What does it cover?
Yeah.
Does it cover your development practices?
And that to me is about having informed people asking the questions, not necessarily like asking all the questions up front in a 100-page questionnaire, but having informed people who are able to ask even just a few questions and understand the answers well enough to say, I see something a little bit odd here, and I'm going to ask you.
But where might we find those people, James? Where might we find all of those people?
I think that there are those kind of people that are everywhere. You've got curious people all over the place. And I
But
think
curious people who understand the context of AI, because it is a kind of a different prospect to, if you're implementing a big ERP,
yeah,
AI is a different thing.
it
So
is different,
how do you find people who know anything about AI now?
you develop them. I think that's the answer. Is that, I mean, and this is why we launched AI Career Pro. It's, for me, it's a case of we launched that to build the talent out there that can ask these kind of questions and actually do AI governance. And I fundamentally believe some of the best people I've worked with, the best at governance, the best at questioning and designing these things, have not necessarily been either engineers or lawyers. They're
Well,
curious
the
people.
lawyers always think they have all the answers. Sorry, lawyers. Sorry,
Well,
some of my best friends are lawyers.
yeah, mine too. Mine too. They have lots of answers. It's just not necessarily to the questions that I'm asking. But but I honestly really do believe that a lot of people can build on their professional skills of asking good questions, bringing together the right perspectives, really thinking through impact and consequences. And I think those are professional skills that come from long careers that people have. And what I'm trying to do with the training that I'm doing is just teach you the little bit more that you need to know about how AI is built, what kind of ways can it go wrong, how to systematically ask these questions and dig into it and build the programs that you would need. So that's really what we're trying to do with AI Career Pro, is figure out what is the gap between somebody who has a strong professional ability but maybe just needs a little bit more training to be able to understand and apply it to AI.
That sounds really like an interesting way to approach it. And it kind of reminds me, there's that saying, it takes a village. Like, takes all of those different perspectives. There's the privacy, the risk management, the engineering, the AI specialists, the lawyers, everybody coming together to help make the products better. And
And
I think that's what you're kind of advocating.
yeah, and the users. I mean, I
Mm.
think I think that's the voice that's often missing. You can bring the engineers and the lawyers together. They're kind of used to working together. They speak weird languages and they fight with each other all the time, but they're kind of used to getting together. The scientists, data scientists are an interesting bunch. I mean, I think you're a data scientist, right? Is your
No, no.
no data governance? Okay. So data scientists are always interesting. They're always the most curious. They ask the best questions. They're always interesting to have a room in these kind of conversations. And the business people who will need to understand the bigger risks, I think they need to be brought into it. But the most useful people to have in the room in these kind of conversations is the people who are actually affected. you're actually going to use. They tell you what the real problems are going to be. They tell you what harms you're imagining. It's really pretty valuable to have them in.
That's a really valuable perspective and one that I heartily endorse. So what do you think would be your advice for people who are starting out on their AI governance journey? Because there are a lot of people trying to work out how to do this right now. What things would you advise them to do?
So most important, my first advice is just figure out where you're starting from strong. So everybody has some strengths. Everybody has some unique perspective or unique strength that makes them particularly valuable. And so I generally start when I'm in there's a course that I make available for free and people can look at it. And the first part of that is looking at like, what are you great at that you can build on? What are the strengths that you have? Because if your background is law, then understanding the EU AI Act and understanding the changes that come about with different laws that are proposed in different countries, that's maybe where your strength is. And you can expand into looking at fundamental human rights impact assessments, and you can build into that space. And the technology is not that scary. If you're a lawyer who has that background, you can expand into it. And so I say first is like understand your discipline and where your strengths are and build from there. The second thing I generally say is you have to use it. So you can't understand AI if you don't use AI. And I'm
Yep.
not saying you don't have to build a machine learning model. You don't have to do that. You might.
We at least use a couple of different flavors of these generative AI apps.
Exactly. Start there and then stretch from there because there's lots of other apps. Like you may not want to use Otter and Fireflies and things like that, but just have a look at them and see what they do. Have a look at the way these tools work. And then once you start using it, it's amazing that I find when people start using OpenAI really well, using Claude, whatever they're using, they start almost all in the same way where they ask questions. It's as if like we've all been trained to use ChatGPT as a question and answer machine. And so we start by asking questions and then getting answers. And that's fine. That's fine, but it's not the most effective way. And after a little while, you start to learn that you can actually say, here's my view. Give me a critique in this kind of style. I want you to act in this kind of way. And you start learning how to ask effective questions. And that's when the power starts to explode. So,
Yeah, and then you want to get into the skills and building your own agents because a lot of these apps have those and they're really handy.
yeah. So number two is use it. And then number three is start the journey of learning. Whereas use some of the free online courses that are out there about learning AI. There's lots of them. Join us on AI Career Pro if people want. There's other courses out there. But I think the worst thing people can do is, I don't know, hope it goes away, or hope it's not relevant, or hope it's not going to impact them in some
Yeah,
way.
AI is
It
not
is.
going away. The AI bubble may well pop like the .com bubble popped, but
Yeah.
the internet still existed and it's still here, and AI is going to exist after the AI bubble pops.
Yeah. And also it's going to change. It's going to change when that happens. And
Mm.
I like, just like the internet changed, it became a very different thing after the dot-com boom. I think AI will change a lot during that process, and maybe the hype will go a little bit away and the wild expectations will go, and we'll start really building much more useful systems. What I personally worry about is the consequences on the workforce and the ability for people to transition and find gainful, meaningful work. It is going to change the workforce enormously.
It is. It is. And, I think governments need to probably start thinking about things like universal basic income sooner rather than later. But I suspect that many of them aren't going to want to do that. But I think it'll come to that because of the scale. Eventually, we're already seeing jobs disappearing. Like I worked with an advertising agency late last year,
Yep.
and they are replacing all their talent. And for those who don't know what talent means, talent is all the human beings they used to hire to be in ads. So they used to hire models, people to do voices and to make video and image ads. They are all AI generated now. So there's a whole class of human beings who used to get regular work in ads whose work has disappeared overnight. Copywriters, their jobs are going away because generative AI is able to replace them. So a lot of those, they're the first jobs, and the call center jobs are going away because there are now chatbots that can replace them. So yeah, we're still going to have a handful of people in call centers, but not the number we used to.
The flip side, though, is that, I mean, it is an incredible productivity multiplier when you use it well. So I think it's fascinating that Australia has struggled with productivity growth. It's one of the worst performers in the OECD in terms of productivity growth over the last number of years. And fortunately, we haven't had major economic consequences as a result, but that catches up. And I think the opportunity for Australia is we've got to start using these kind of tools, technology, really pushing into it to try to drive up productivity. I would say personally, I'm many times more productive now using AI than I was 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah, I resisted initially, and then I started using it, and then I found it rubbish because it was early days. And in the last 2 years, I've come to use it really a lot, and it's a productivity multiplier. I can do much more than I used to. So I think this is a good time to draw it to a close. Thanks so much, James. It was a really interesting chat. We'll pop the link to the free course that James mentioned into the links. And thank you very much for joining me.
No, thank you, Kate, for having me. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you.
Bye bye.